Hello, incredibly beautiful community. We're gonna hang because I think we've got to talk about the global ideology doing the rounds. It's coming to a ballot box near you. And the ideology isn't Putinism, but Putinism is an extreme example of that ideology that's washing up all over us everywhere. And we are seeing, especially in the last year, an accelerated vulnerability to that ideology in the West. So it's incredibly important to talk about it. I've just released a video on the main channel covering this because I think this ideology that we're all going to be increasingly familiar with has three pillars. Pillars are wrong words, because ideology is often a kind of wash, a kind of canvas we use to orient ourselves in the political world. So it's inherently fluid, inherently elusive, inherently unconfinable to a set of analytical propositional claims. But despite that, I try to do a kind of clarity about that on the main channel. And that means that so much that really matters has been left off the page. I like that because the point is to get you to think, not to get you to believe what I believe. But I think that it would be enormously useful, given this is of not just primary but urgent social importance for us all, to have a little seance together and sort of chat this through in a much slower pace, and also have me sitting here not knowing what on earth I'm going to say to you. My health is not amazing at the moment. I'm struggling to do this, but I'm very thrilled about doing it, and I'm going to get your help to make me get through this video, because you always help me. So the ideology of the Putin regime specifically is often talked about. But I think there are two kinds of issues with the way it's talked about. The first issue is that it's not talked about in the context of it being a global wash of an ideological kind, of which then Putinism is an extreme example. Most discussions of Putin's ideology are, what the hell is going on in Russia? Well, that's very interesting to us in a sort of know thy enemy sense, because there's a Russo-Chinese quasi-alliance threatening our security in Europe. But the reality is that we have a very narrow understanding of our ideological exposure here if we do that, because then we think, well, as long as we get rid of Russian interference, which we can't get rid of, but if we hypothetically could, we'd take care of the problem. But the problem is that getting rid of Russian interference, which is real in our democracies, would maintain 95% of the problem. Because the problem isn't that Putin is a sort of causal spreader of this, although he is a spreader of it. The issue is that Putin is himself a very advanced patient of a global disease which is beginning to infect us too. Now, please, YouTube, don't think that I'm talking about health here. Don't ban this video. We're doing analogies. So, let me tell you a little bit about the second thing that goes wrong with talk about Russian ideologies. And it's something that kind of goes wrong and goes right. And that's that ideology is talked about in ways that a political philosopher ought not recognize as conversations about ideology. That's to say, there's a lot of really good social scientific coverage of Putin's ideology, whereby what you get really is an account of the beliefs and images that the Putin regime pumps into the informational environment. But that's not quite ideology, because it's possible that the Putin regime never articulates the key tenets of its own ideology. And in fact, it's necessarily true that that's the case. um, because ideology is the way we map the world. It sits on the edge of the conscious and the subconscious. It's not confinable to definition. And so you often get really top class social scientific accounts of the worldview of the Putin regime, the worldview the Putin regime promotes, exploitatively or sincerely. And there are several pieces of this kind that I actually highly recommend. One of them is by Maria Snegovaya and Jade McGlynn. We're very big fans of Jade McGlynn on the channels. Dissecting Putin's regime ideology. I might talk about that piece specifically, actually, on another occasion, because it's quite well done. Then there is another school of thought which says that ideology is historical. Ideology, if it's going to be something like fascization or fascism, is something that happened in the 1930s in Europe. And outside of that historical context, it doesn't make sense to talk about it. Well, I'm sorry, ideology is how humans map their political world. Ideology cannot be an historical event if there is continuity between that event and our culture, which there obviously is. Yet another way of thinking of ideology is a sort of a more definitional way. And that says that there've got to be 5 or 6 ingredients, and they either get proper ticks or nothing happens. We don't get, let's say, fascism. And I think that misses out on identifying what's going on ideologically, because it misses out the fluid nature and the embodied nature of ideologies, right? There are ways of negotiating the political world. As Jason Blakely rightly argues in his recent excellent book on ideology. I think then there is another way of thinking about ideology, and that's to think of it in terms of systems, political systems, and descriptions of political systems. And that too doesn't capture the fact that we're dealing with a kind of an embodied way in which you and I map the way we negotiate the political world. Everyone has an ideology. It's just a question of how truthful your ideological picture is, how susceptible it is to fantasy and wishful thinking and destructive impulses and so on. And so all of these ways of talking about ideology are actually very useful and can teach us an enormous amount about political systems or about particular regimes. And I welcome greatly a lot of that work. Marlène Laruelle has just released an important book on ideology. Again, it's a book I warmly recommend. Don't get it yet. It's hardback, and it'll be in paperback in a couple of months, probably much cheaper. So there is a lot of useful stuff out there, but I don't think it's too rude to say about a lot of that stuff that it's not clear that these are conversations about actual ideology. They're enormously useful conversations about politically adjacent things to ideology, which are then labeled as conversations about ideology. So let's get a little bit into my claims in the video. And what I want you to do is watch the video before or after this chat. It doesn't matter which way around it is. If you've seen it, this will be super useful. If you haven't seen it, that's also fantastic. So go watch it at the end, because it'll just crystallize. It's very condensed. With my current health issues, it took a month to bring it out. So I begin by saying that Putinism is spreading, that it's spreading in Europe, that it's spreading in America, and that we might not clearly see it yet, but it's coming to sort of our ballot box wherever we are. And what I want to do, I say in that video, is show that this is not about contagion, as being infected by something political coming to us from Russia, but it's about convergence. So there are global forces that are creating a kind of an ideological wash that's affecting us all. If you are in the UK, it's affecting you quite a bit. If you are in Russia, you're a very severe patient of the same disease. So these are differences largely in severity, even though there are many distinctivenesses country to country. And so this might sound to a lot of people's ears like it's another conversation about Russian interference. It's precisely not that, because I'm saying that Russia isn't the source here. Add some fuel to the fire, but it's not the source. It's itself a very, very severe case of a disease that threatens us all. So that means that this stuff is coming up for us organically. And it's scary because this is not supposed to happen. It's scary because we don't know what to do about it, except to just start calling things out or scream about disinformation or complain how we keep losing to authoritarian populists without knowing how to beat them. So there's a real feeling of a lack of control and kind of historical shock because, like, historical anomaly is becoming normality. What the hell is going on? Can someone switch us back to the regular script, please? And I think that does incline us actually to jump toward the notion of malign foreign interference as a central cause. But that's our own instinct to engage in conspiracy theory as opposed to facing reality, because it's easier to say that the problem is external, and if we only sort the problem of Russian interference out, then we're going to be all right at home, because at home we're not growing this stuff. Well, we're growing this stuff at a rate of 20-1 compared to the degree to which Putin is inserting this stuff into our democracies. He is inserting it, but we are 20xing his insertions in terms of organic growth domestically. So, but you can't have that conversation without sort of putting out of consideration one element of Putinism that is indeed distinctive and it's not going anywhere, it's not traveling anywhere, and that's Putin's mysticism. And that has several elements. One is this bizarre Russian idea that to win you have to lose, that you have to start in a farther back position, and only the one who starts in such a position will be able to end up at the front of the race eventually. Then there's a sort of a second element of a kind of a historical fate without progress. History is not progressive. History is not getting better. So anti-Fukuyamianism, non-teleological stuff. But history elevates a country that it has chosen to elevate, and that's going to be Russia. And there's a minor element that I do detect in the Kremlin that shouldn't be over-exaggerated, but it's present. That's a kind of a self-annihilation. There's a kind of a titillation about a nihilistic conception of themselves in the Kremlin, and we shouldn't reduce it to zero. We shouldn't just say, well, it's the way they talk. Putin does talk like that, right? If Russia's not going to be in the world, what's the point of there being a world? And by Russia, he means himself. But there's a 3.8% translation of that into how these people actually think, which is enough to say that these are very different people to us and very different people to Soviet leaders. Soviet leaders were much more Western in that regard than Putin and some in his close circle. So that stuff ain't going to travel anywhere. It's to do with the special conditions in Russia. It's to do with the fact that Russia is only a very Western country at the level of its high culture. That's to do with the sort of wonky way in which Russia went through the Enlightenment. There's a special story to be told there about why this is a cultural particularity. It ain't coming our way. But there are three elements of this global ideology which Putin manifests in an extreme sense, and which Trump also shares, which we need to talk about. And these are, first of all, in size, monarchism, and then fascism, and then neoliberalism. And so what I do in that video is that I give what I think are traits of these ideologies, and then cartoonishly rate Putin and Trump out of 10 on these traits. And obviously Putin comes out easily on top. But the point of the exercise is not to confine this to Trump and Putin. We can run this stuff on Netanyahu, on Nigel Farage, on Marine Le Pen, you name it. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the ex-conservative right in the West that's given up on democracy and is engaging in post-truth politics that's sort of aimed at breaking democratic institutions, the post-conservative right, ex-conservative right in Europe that's set to dominate in the next election cycles, in fact shares this ideological sort of triad, that shares this global ideology, which consists of monarchism, fascism, and neoliberalism. So the first thing I do, which really could be almost a freestanding piece in itself, is run an imagination prodding story about fascism and rank Putin and Trump out of 10 on each trait. And then I do that with monarchism, and then I do that with neoliberalism. Again, let's remind ourselves what we said at the beginning. When I'm saying that these two guys, but not only them, the ex-conservative right in the West, when I'm saying that they are monarchists, I am not deploying some kind of theoretical account of a political system or a theoretical account of an ideology. So I am not really actually in conversation with, just brought this to illustrate some nice literature on the topic of monarchism. For example, from Francesca Antonini's book, Caesarism and Bonapartism. Now, that's actually a book that Greg Uden often refers to when he talks about the monarchist turn in global politics. The way I'm doing this, what I am doing when I'm telling you that Putin and Trump are monarchists, is not advancing a theory of the functioning of a society, the functioning of a regime. What I'm saying is that there are a set of cultural items that are floating about, which pull and tug us all, to which we then respond more or less favorably, that are very, very prominent in our society. So you see what I mean? What I'm really talking about is what kind of picture of politics do Western citizens have? And what part of this picture of monarchism or of politics is made up by a kind of vision, a kind of image of legitimated monarchist rule, about which we're going to say more in a moment. You see what I mean? So we're talking about an embodied way in which we map the world. We're talking about something that's a little bit in all of our heads, but is a lot in the heads of an increasingly large minority or a small majority of citizens in the West, which is why we're increasingly voting for monarchist political candidates who say, I'll fix it, screw the institutions. Institutions may have been failing, but we can't screw institutions because they're the only game in town. Without our political institutions, we can't get anything done, be it climate, be it defense. So I start with fascism. And I say that fascism, having thought about it for a quarter century, is best described in public, because we might need to have an even longer and more perfunctorily boring conversation about it in private, but we have to be concise and we have to say things that are clear enough that they can be sort of almost like footballs we can throw around from one to another without them losing their shape, without them losing their meaning. You don't want a definition of fascism in politics, well, period. But you don't want like a sketch of what fascism is in politics that is fragile. It's like a bit of 18th century China that you're throwing from one's hand to another, and it just will smash. You need it to be like a proper football that can take a bit of crashing and banging. So I say that the first element of fascism is what I call revolutionary conservatism, and that's simply the idea that you are after radical change, but according to a vision of a magical past. And that means that, straight away, fascism draws elements from conservatism, a return to a past, or return to a past that never was, and draws elements from socialism, or at least the revolutionary elements in socialism, where you're asking for radical social transformation. And that's what immediately goes wrong. Here's what immediately goes wrong for people like Jordan Peterson, who notice this and then conclude that 20th century European fascism may have been socialist. As I say in the main channel video, that's a bit like saying that a roast chicken is an omelette. It's the point that ideologies are fluid. Just because fascism draws from conservatism and socialism doesn't make it conservative or socialist. Doesn't make it reducible to the one or the other, doesn't make it a fusion of the two. It's its own distinctive ideology that shares a lot with other ideologies. I mean, and this is the point. All the ideologies doing the rounds in our culture have a kind of hold on everybody, at least a tiny bit. And it's a question of how much something has a hold on you. So that's why we need these sort of quite crude definitions or sketches of what fascism is, for instance, in political discourse. Because if the question is asked in the context of an academic seminar, is every single person in society a tiny bit fascist? The answer is, of course. Of course, they couldn't not be, because all the ideologies in our culture have a pull on everybody, and they all intermingle, right? So if you're a socialist, you're clearly going to be a conservative in some ways. If you're a conservative, you're clearly going to be a socialist in some ways. It just might be fluid, partial. There might be a little bit of permeation, a little bit of an echo of an ideology that's not mainly your own in your own ideological map. That's just inevitable. And so I ranked Putin 8 out of 10 on this element of revolutionary conservatism, and I ranked Trump 6 out of 10. And the reason I did that is because you can absolutely have fascism without public mobilization, but public mobilization is a very important feature of a fascist picture of society, right? You've got to imagine people sort of marching with the ruler. And when that's absent, even if many of the other features are there, you can't give a 9 or a 10 score. And this is being measured in the video, and you'll check that out when you catch it, according to a kind of ideological intensity scale I invented that starts from a low level, whereby it's 0 to 2, the ideology is absent for the reason I just explained. We're all a little bit ideologically affected by different ideologies. And then perhaps something like 2 to 4, there's signs of the ideology, sort of 4 to 7, 4 to 8. There's definite presence of the ideology. At 8 to 10, somebody's a raging expression of that ideology. And I won't give you all the scores I gave in the main video, but let's keep jumping through what I talked about. The second feature of fascism is a kind of a politics of enemies, where you keep widening the circle of enemies within. And here I gave both of them not peak, but relatively high scores. Again, because of the absence of public mobilization, you can't quite give Trump and Putin sort of peak scores on fascism, but you can do that on monarchism, which we'll come to in a moment. I think a third very important trait of fascism is the notion of action as an end in itself. So I do something that's the wrong thing to do, but if I do it with virility, it becomes the right thing to do. So there's a kind of a very important post-truth element that Tim Snyder often talks about, that we mustn't forget, that is to do with the glorification and even aesthetization of action as an end in itself. And that, of course, is a derivative, a distortion of a very important romantic concept of self-transformation through willpower. The romantic movement in the West is something you could hear Isaiah Berlin's lectures on YouTube. And it's very important in understanding many of the 20th century political forces. So the fourth element of fascism is that you think of the state as a semi-spiritual organization. And because it's a semi-spiritual organization, it shouldn't really be something you can peel yourself away from. So it's something that's got to conjoin with the leader and conjoin with the people in a kind of a single, organic, self-propelling sort of political mission that's going wherever it's meant to go. And here I didn't give Putin and Trump very high scores. There's obviously the cult of the leader, whereby the leader again is the state is the people, and of course dissent is treason. Then I talked about the importance of the inexpressible in fascism, and that again is a derivation from the Romantic movement. Something about the organicity of political life is very, very important, that the things that matter are unsayable. You see how fast we can drift to a post-truth situation here, right? And in the video, I talk about ways in which there are elements of this idea that you shouldn't trust analysis in both Trumpism and Putinism, but of course much more so in Putinism than in Trumpism still. 7 is just a state of permanent emergency. That's a very important facet of fascist psychology. This is an emergency situation, which means we get to do things that we ourselves agree are normally not okay. Recognize how often you see that speech. You see, all of these qualities, they're not things that you should sort of visualize appearing in a textbook. Visualize it appearing in your neighbors who vote a certain way. Right? We're in a state of emergency, and yeah, ABC shouldn't be done, but yeah, it's a state of emergency, so let's do it. And so I came up with a kind of situation where I gave Putin 6+ out of 10 on fascism, and Trump about 5. So Trump is at the very lowest end of being defined by that ideological wash. But don't forget, we're not saying they're fascist. We're saying that they're ideological in a way that draws an enormous amount from fascism and monarchism and neoliberalism, combines that into a single ideological flotilla. Now, where it really takes off is when we come to monarchism. And again, monarchism is about what's in the minds of humans as they, in 2025 in the West, negotiate relationships they have with one another, mediated by institutions they share. Monarchism is not an account of a political system. It's not a political theory that we're applying to practice. We're talking about what's in the minds of your neighbors. And in particular, we're talking about what's in the minds of your neighbors that they don't know about, even though it is in their minds. And I say that there are several features to monarchism. One is that the leader is the only source of legitimacy. And cartoonishly, I've raved on about monarchism for a while, and I've just said that it is the idea that the only source of political legitimacy is the leader. Second feature of it is, again, that there is a state of emergency. Again, we have ideological permeation. We've just said the very same thing from a fascist picture. From a monarchist picture, you need the leader to declare various kinds of states of emergency to fix the country. Fix the country. And both on leader as the only source of legitimacy and on state of emergency, Putin and Trump rate very highly, I'm afraid. The third element is rejection of institutions, because they are impersonal, and only personal power matters. Courts, parliaments, journalistic institutions are just weird, unhealthy, useless, cumbersome, obstructive, or worse, horrifically corrupt or enemy-serving, impersonal calamities, where you basically have to say, look, to get beyond all of this stuff that we're struggling with, we need personal power. The fourth is rejection of ideology, the fourth element of monarchism. And the rejection of ideology basically comes from the thought that whatever the monarch does is right. That's a huge part of Trump's and Putin's psychology. And I give it an important example that I actually didn't talk about enough on the channels about Putin's relationship with Navalny, because Putin's main objection to Navalny, but this is for Putin not just a practical, it's also a principled objection, is that Navalny had no power. So you say to Putin, Putin, you took out your key political opponent. Bad behavior, appalling behavior, criminal behavior. Putin's answer is, but he had no power. And I have power. And power eats up the powerless in the world in which we live. And that's how it should be. And so his question to the Russian opposition was always, from the early 2010s, is, you're asking things, but who are you? Like, who do you represent? What political force is behind you? And the Russian opposition answered, yeah, we'll just keep marching on the street, and we represent civilization, Western democracy. Okay, where is your power? Oh, you don't have any. You're not legitimate because you don't have power. And so Putin doesn't need to be, if you like, ideologically right here, beyond just saying that he has power, and that makes him ideologically right. And then the fifth element that's hugely important and makes monarchism a kind of opposite of fascism, and that's that leader acts on a demobilized population. So it's the very opposite of fascism. And here Trump and Putin are very high, of course, because Trump fundamentally wants assent from voters who are 1/4 paying attention and 3/4 are either surviving or consuming. Putin, much the same. He is politicizing Russia domestically, little by little, but still preponderantly relies on a depoliticized population to keep power. So here Putin gets over 9 and Trump gets over 8 on my funny intensity, ideological intensity scale, which you'll see. And then we come to a third pillar, which is what I call hyper-neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is, as you know, because I've banged on about it like a lunatic, for me, is not a commitment to the free market. A commitment to the free market, if it is clearly articulated, for me is not a neoliberal position. Neoliberalism is when there is a magical commitment to the primacy of the market. If you say, Vlad, let's privatize the rail in this country for 7 reasons, and I really believe that these 7 reasons play a role in your thought, I'm not going to call you a neoliberal. But if you say, let's privatize the rail because magic privatization good, I am going to call you a neoliberal. So it's a magical primacy put on the market. And what's remarkable is that this kind of putting of magical primacy on the market under certain social conditions which generate distrust, if these conditions are there, actually morphs neoliberalism into a kind of might is right politics. You go from saying, let's prioritize constrained market competition to let's prioritize completely unbounded, unconstrained competition where might is right. And so you get this very freaky situation where 2 things happen. People who support the market suddenly begin saying, oh no, it's the strongest out there wins. And the second thing that happens is that they have got there incrementally via a kind of process of social morphing, having started in a position of just wanting the free market. So just wanting the free market under conditions of severe distrust can actually lead one, or tends to risk leading one, into a might is right fascistized politics. Now, don't conclude from that that means that we're going to call free marketeers the F word. We're not doing that. But we're saying that for some free marketeers, under certain social conditions, there's this very significant risk of this kind of morphing happening. And that's exactly what happened in Russia. Look at the people, many of the people around Putin, and look at where they were in the early 90s. And you see this very clear line, and you see it very clearly happening in Western countries little by little too. So I think the historical chain runs something like this. Neoliberal depoliticization leads to the collapse of solidarity. The collapse of solidarity creates a kind of atomized competition, and atomized competition eventually leads to a kind of normalization of might is right as the only arbiter. And how hyper neoliberal are Putin and Trump? Well, I actually gave Trump a 9 and Putin an 11 on this. And so it's not trivial at this point to note that Greg Eugen sees Putin's war in Ukraine as itself a kind of extension of neoliberalism, or as I would put it in my lingo, a transference of neoliberalism into hyper-neoliberalism. And I quote Greg in the video, I say for Putin, he says, for Putin, war is just neoliberalism's logic played out with tanks instead of balance sheets. Don't jump to the trivial conclusion that anybody here, as is conventionally popular on the left, is calling free marketeers authoritarian and calling them the F word. We're not doing that. What we're saying is that under certain social conditions, there is a structured risk of morphing here. So everything that we've said is not about Trump or Putin, really. It's about the entire ex-conservative right in the West that's winning, and is winning more in the last 12 months if you look at public sentiment and polls in Europe. And it's going to keep winning more. We can cut their gains by engaging in very constructive democratic regeneration. We need to emphasize patriotism. We need to emphasize listening to the feelings of our citizens. We need to emphasize economic democratization. We need to be bold. We need to engage in pro-institutional but some populist rhetoric and so on. We're not doing any of that. We are complacently reproducing 1990s technocratic liberal centrism, which is getting obliterated by this wash of what? Fascicized hyper-neoliberal monarchism. Or just hyper-neoliberal monarchism with a fascist twist, however you want to label it. Awful, horrendous label. But what I want to say is the label matters because I'm picking out a single reservoir. These are not three. These things don't operate as three separate strains in our culture. They have now formed a reservoir that is the upcomingly dominant ideology in the West, in Europe and in North America. And so the question is not how do we stop Russian interference, it's how do we stop our political systems organically coming to look a bit like Russia. And so the reason I found making this video really important is that it's a kind of a complement piece to the Trump narcissism video. Especially if you do want to start thinking about this via the Trump-Putin relationship. Because Trump is narcissistically married to Putin in the way that we explained in that main channel video. But then you also have to say that, yes, there are enormous structured conflicts between the USA and Russia that Trump can't avoid. So you can't just be Putin's best buddy. But despite that, at the level of ideology, there's plenty of other politics and geopolitics pulling in the opposite direction. But at the level of ideology, Trump is enormously inclined to brother up with Putin because they share the same ideology. Or if you like, same global disease, of which Putin is much more systematic and advanced patient. As long as you just take away the mystical twist that others aren't going to share. And so if you want to understand Trump's relationship with Putin, I'm saying you've got to grasp both the narcissism, which is one separate discussion we had on the main channel, but also the ideological affinity. However, beyond all of this, I think what really matters isn't Trump and Putin. Trump will be gone. And there are many sort of implosive qualities to Trumpism. That means that Trumpism could implode, but authoritarianism in America will only get stronger. Hyper-neoliberal, fascist monarchism in America will only get stronger, whatever happens to Trump. So you've got to take that very seriously beyond Trump, and recognize that this is a wave that's coming over us, and we've got to both resist it, somehow dilute it, diffuse it, build certain barriers, also get our snorkeling gear out so we don't start crying when water gets in our eyes in 2029 and 2032. So that's where we are, and it's time to talk about it, because this is not coming ahead in the future. It's arriving already. It's, little by little, and we've got to capture it. And I'm trying to give us a vocabulary for it, but don't get put in handcuffs by my vocabulary for it. Use my vocabulary to help you grasp what it is that I am grasping and trying to convey to you in the video, right? It's much more important that you reckon with this reservoir that I'm trying to capture than that you come away from my video and just sort of internalize all of my tags and labels. The tags and labels are psychological clues to get you to look in the right direction so that you stop missing it. Because again, literally dozens of you write me every single week and say, Vlad, how do you know democratic decline is inevitable? It can all just bounce back 3 years from now, right? And I feel love for that. I don't share the perspective of some people who say, well, if Western citizens are so delusional, they deserve to lose their democracy. I mean, if you don't put on your socks and you go out in the cold, you're going to get cold. Like, what do you expect? No, I'm sorry. I think it's possible to be a deliciously misanthropic minor public intellectual. I'm not that. I'm a loving public intellectual. So, but we've got to be awake to where we're at, right? We don't need to just, keep sitting at the beach and keep layering on the sunscreen. We got to understand that weather conditions are changing. And we've got to begin developing a vernacular for it. And that video, I hope, is something to watch, maybe something to even come back to, because it stimulates our vernacular. Because you can't really even challenge things unless you can conceptualize them, unless you can capture them. And I've captured you for 44 minutes. So with enormous gratitude, thank you for helping me to get through this. Lots of love, and go watch the video on the main channel if you haven't seen it. It's below, it's here, and it's one of the most important videos I've made, and I believe it's the most accessible, it might be the most accessible short statement on the ideological challenge we're facing in the West right now, this terrible ideology that's washing up on our shores. Bad analogy, that we are ourselves generating organically. It's probably the best short intro to this, but it is rapid and it is quick fire and is demanding. So there we go, beautiful community. If you haven't, go and watch. Lots of love. It's 20 minutes long.